Welcome back, history students. All right, let's finish up the chapter on the Age of Association, and then we'll start talking a little bit about the American West. So, just to recap, we were talking about reform in the Age of Association. We talked about how many women got involved in reforms, mainly because of a religious revival. Reforms that women were involved in included the suffrage movement, the anti-alcohol movement, the temperance movement, the asylum movement, the abolitionist movement. So today we're going to talk about something that many women did to help the less fortunate, especially in cities. And this was the sharing of middle-class domestic skills. And this was something that a lot of middle-class women were involved in. During the Age of Association, there was an emphasis on women's domestic skills. It was believed back then that there is a certain way that a woman should take care of the household, of the children, of the domestic duties. And there were middle-class women reformers who believed that they knew the correct way to keep a house and to take care of their children, and they wanted to share their beliefs about the proper way to do domestic work with less fortunate women, especially immigrant women, who they felt didn't live up to their expectation of doing domestic work. Now, later on, I'm going to talk about something called the settlement house. Those emerge a little bit later in another reform period called the Progressive Era. But the purpose of that was for women to share middle-class values on domestic skills with the less fortunate. One example of an organization in New York City that was founded to share domestic skills with immigrants was called the New York Children's Aid Society. I have it on your outline. This was a group organized in 1853 by a Methodist minister named Charles Brace. B-R-A-C-E. Charles Brace was very concerned about poor immigrant children living in New York City. In the mid-1800s, we start to see an influx of immigrants coming into American cities. And Charles Brace was very concerned about the poor immigrant children. Now, immigrants had a hard time blending into American society. They often had a hard time finding jobs, had a hard time finding decent housing, and many of immigrants would be paid less than white workers would for the same work. So, in this group called the New York Children's Aid Society, middle-class women volunteered to teach poor immigrant women the proper domestic skills like sewing, cleaning, cooking, raising children. One of the sad things that the New York Children's Aid Society did from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s was known as the orphan train movement. If volunteers in the New York Children's Aid Society did not feel that the children were getting cared for up to their standards, then the New York Children's Aid Society would have the children placed in foster homes in rural areas in the Midwest, far away from New York City. And this became known as the orphan train movement, which began in the mid-1850s and lasted till the early 1900s. So what would happen, now, there were immigrant children that were orphaned. So some of the orphans were orphans. Their parents died. But a lot of the immigrant children that were sent in the orphan trains had parents, but the New York Children's Aid Society decided the parents weren't fit to raise the children. And so many, many immigrant children were put on trains and sent to live with good Christian families in the Midwest. And they would be raised according to middle-class Christian values. So they estimate between about 1854 and 1860, 5,000 children were placed in new homes. That's just up to 1860. The orphan train movement continued on till the early 1900s. So these children would end up in the homes of Christian families in places like Iowa, the Midwest, states in the Midwest. And that was known as the orphan train movement. So there were thousands of children that were taken from the cities, like New York, and put on trains to go out west. That was part of reform. You know, we think of that today, especially separating children from their parents, as a negative thing, because we know the psychological effects separating a child from their parents can cause. But back in the 1800s, they thought this was the best thing for the kids, was to leave the slums of the cities, leave poverty, move to the Midwest, and live on a farm, right, with farm families where things may have been a little bit more economically stable. But separating children from their parents is going to cause damage. So we look on this today as a mistake that this organization did, but back then they thought they were doing the best thing for the children. So that was an example of another reform that women were involved in the Age of Association. So I hinted a little bit before that there wasn't many reforms. There were not many reforms in the South because a big reform in the North was the anti-slavery movement, and there is no anti-slavery movement in the South. So this whole chapter, I've been focusing on the North, right? Every group I've mentioned was in the Northeast. And every reformer I've mentioned were from the Northeast, with the exception of the Grimke sisters, who were from the South but moved north. Many abolitionists were involved in the other reforms. For example, many women in the suffrage movement were also part of the abolitionist movement. Many women in the temperance movement were also part of the abolitionist movement. And so we have less reform interest in the South because there's such a tie between the anti-slavery movement and all the other reforms. Now, I should mention that by the 1820s, the North and South have developed very differently. The South has remained more farming and very rural, and they rely on slave labor. Whereas the North is more urban, it has more cities, has more industry, and it relies on free labor. By the time we get to the early 1800s, many northern states have begun to outlaw slavery. So we have the North and South really developing very differently. There's less reform interest in the South. You know, obviously there's no anti-slavery movement. It's also less urban in the South. So issues that we talked about, like prostitution, immigration, alcohol abuse, isn't as much of a issue in the South because those are city problems. There's less issues in the South, and there's less interest in reform. So as a result, Southern women are not as active in reform as Northern women. Now, after the Civil War, when slavery is abolished, that's when reform comes to the South. So we don't have Southern women involved in the women's suffrage movement until after the Civil War. Then women joined the suffrage movement from the South. So that's what I want to say about reform in the South and women. All right, we're going to move on to the chapter on the American West. I'm going to give you a brief history of how the U.S. expanded westward gradually. So in this class, we've talked about the 13 colonies, right? We talked about the Revolutionary War. So the United States originally was 13 states, 13 little colonies on the East Coast. In 1803, the U.S. purchased a huge swath of land called the Louisiana Territory from France. And that one deal doubled the size of the U.S. So that ended up buying New Orleans and pretty much all the land in the Midwest. As the 1800s progressed, Americans began to focus more and more on expansion. I'm going to put this map up from Creative Commons. This is a map about the Mexican War. This will help you kind of visualize the U.S. So up to 1848, all this land here that's kind of a dark tan was the United States territory. Okay? In 1845, there was an American editor who coined a term to describe the ambitions Americans had to move westward. And his name was John L. O'Sullivan. John L. O'Sullivan. And the term he coined is called manifest destiny. So John O'Sullivan published an article in which he said it was America's manifest destiny to control North America from coast to coast. So he believed that the U.S. should stretch from the eastern part of North America all the way to the Pacific Ocean here. And that's our manifest destiny. It's really an idea based on this thing called nationalism. You know, nationalism is this idea that the U.S. is a great country. We have a right to expand so we can spread our way of life, democracy. And it's really this idea that America is an exceptional nation. We have a right to expand from coast to coast. So that's the idea of manifest destiny that was popular. At the time that O'Sullivan coined that term, America already was expanding westward. Now I'm going to talk about Texas. You know, we know Texas is here now. In around 1820, there were American families that moved to what we know today as Texas. Now, Texas originally was controlled by the country of Spain. Spain used to control a lot of land in the Americas. And so the Spanish government gave American families permission to move to Texas. But in 1821, Mexico, which is here, revolted against Spain because Mexico was once ruled by Spain. Ever since the 1500s, Mexico was ruled by Spain. So Mexico rose up against Spain. They wanted their independence in 1821, and they defeated Spain, and they gained all of the Spanish territory in the western part of the Americas, including what today is Texas. So the Americans that were living in Texas now are living in Mexican land. First they were living on Spanish land. Now, more and more Americans were living in Texas. And in Texas, their way of life was farming or setting up ranches. And the American families that lived in Texas did own slaves. Well, by the 1830s, the Mexican government realized there are more Americans living in Texas than people from Mexico. And they wanted to assert their authority over this huge population of people in Texas who were technically Americans. And so the country of Mexico began to create laws for the people of Texas, which angered the people of Texas. So one thing that Mexico did was they told the Texans, you can't own slaves anymore. And they tried to limit the trade between the Texans and the U.S. And that angered the Americans living in Texas, and they eventually organized an army, and Mexico kept sending more and more troops to Texas to keep order. Eventually we have clashes, and we have what's called the Texas Revolution in 1836, where the Americans living in Texas revolted against Mexico. And they won. They actually captured the leader of Mexico and forced him to sign a paper freeing Texas from Mexico. So that's the first step westward, because the Texans are Americans. Although the U.S. doesn't annex Texas, Texas is its own country for a while. They are free from Mexico, but they're not part of the United States. So we see in the 1830s, Americans moving a little bit further west. Now, in 1845, the United States officially made Texas a state because the Texans wanted to be part of the U.S. And they got their wish. They were officially made a slave state in 1845. Well, that angered the country of Mexico. That led to the Mexican-American War. Mexico, the government, really never recognized Texas independence. And when the U.S. made Texas a state, they felt like they were taking their territory. And that led to tension between the U.S. and Mexico, which led to a full war we call the Mexican-American War, which happened in 1846 and ended in 1848. This was a quick, successful war for the U.S. because the U.S. quickly invaded Mexico and defeated the country. This is a very quick war. By 1847, the U.S. had conquered Mexico. And the formal peace treaty is called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which I have on your outline. That treaty was signed in February of 1848, and the U.S. won all of this territory that we know is the western part of the U.S. now. So the states today of California, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, all used to be part of Mexico. Now, the U.S. did pay Mexico $15 million for the land and erased a $3 million debt that they had owed the U.S. But that treaty allowed the U.S. to fulfill its manifest destiny. Now, the United States stretches from coast to coast, from ocean to ocean, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Now, the westward expansion did cause tension between the North and South because the North wanted the western states to be free states and the South wanted the western states to become slave states. And it set up this rivalry between the North and South that's going to set us up for the Civil War, which I'm going to get to in a later chapter. Let's talk about the gold rush for a minute in California. Unfortunately for Mexico, the same year that the treaty was signed, gold was discovered in Northern California. Now, at first, the miners tried to keep it a secret, but rumors started, and by 1849, everyone around the world had heard about the California gold rush. And we had 80,000 people in 1 year rush to California to look for gold. Half of those people were Americans, and the other half came from around the world. There were people who came to California from South America, from Asia, from Europe, because they wanted to get rich quick. We call those people who rushed to California in 1849 the 49ers. So, what's the name of the football team in San Francisco? The 49ers. Why is that? Because San Francisco is near where the gold rush was. And so their football team is named in honor of all the people who rushed to California in 1849. The reason we talk about the gold rush in a history class isn't to tell you that people got rich. Very few gold rushers became millionaires. That doesn't happen. They might have found a little bit of gold here and there, not enough to be rich. So the gold rush isn't important because everybody became a millionaire. The gold rush is important because many of those 49ers and other miners, other people that came in the next decade, stayed out west and bought land, started businesses, and helped to develop the West. That's how the American West developed so quickly, was because of the gold rush. So we end up having a greater population out west. We end up having the beginning of cities out west, industry, people set up farms, they set up ranches. So there were Native Americans living out west, but overall there wasn't a lot of people living in the West. So in the next video, I am going to talk about the movement westward, a little bit about that, and a little bit about why people moved out west. So that's where I'll leave this video. I'll see you in the next one.